Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So welcome to Face to Face once again at 3:26 here on a beautiful sunny afternoon. It's about time, and we're just moving into spring, it seems to me, and we've got a guest with us today, former Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty, Rob Rayner. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you very much, David. I'm looking forward to it.
So Rob's got about 20 years of experience in not-for-profit leadership. He's got the gift of the gab, and that is not meant to be used in a pejorative sense at all, Rob. Rob and I met about 6 weeks ago. I reached out to him. We had breakfast. It was we had a wonderful time, and it was one of those meetings where I don't know if you would agree or not, Rob, but I felt like we could have easily spent the rest of the day together just talking about issues and maybe not actually coming to any resolutions, but at least starting to go beyond scratching the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I felt the same way, and I would say we could probably spend a better part of a really great weekend just kind of going through a whole bunch of topics. Because I think we both recognized that there's incredible complexity often behind the issues of the day. At the same time, by getting to core values, we can reduce some of that complexity to a level of simplicity, which I think is helpful. And we were just kind of scratching the surface on a range of topics, but it was nice to feel a sense of common cause around those things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always helpful to find out that there are others that are sort of waving the same flag.
Mm-hmm. And looking beyond the surface of things, which I think we very, very much have to do when we look at issues such as the one that we're going to be talking about here momentarily.
So you want to You believe income security is a human right. You want to reframe poverty. You want to talk about human rights. And, just before we actually hit the record button, we were talking a little bit about where you're heading. You're going to be speaking at a conference coming up soon, I think, on the East Coast. And you said, I start to look at this. I start to dig a little bit deeper. And I say, oh, my God, what kind of a country are we living in? Can you talk a little bit more about that, Rob?
Yeah, well, I don't have to go more than a half a kilometer at most out of my apartment here in Ottawa before I'll come across a person who is begging for their existence, begging for help, panhandling. And that's how I got involved in the poverty issue back in 2006, as I had come to Ottawa in 2004 from a small town, very small town in New Brunswick, where poverty exists, but does so in a more invisible way. You don't tend to see people panhandling in very small towns.
Right.
In fact, the people who are panhandling, who represent the most marginalized, the most desperate people in our society, tend to migrate to bigger centers. So I'd actually had, I guess, the good fortune of not having to live in a city or not having lived in a city for some time when I was living in New Brunswick. But when I came to Ottawa in 2004, really came face to face with this phenomenon of homelessness and panhandling on the streets of a big city in a very, very wealthy country. And you also don't have to go more than 50 meters, from my apartment to encounter, big time wealth that exists here in Ottawa.
Right.
So the two things exist side by side. And what struck me as I got the opportunity to work on the poverty issue is that there were seemed to be relatively few individuals and organizations who were really acting on it from a human rights point of view. And through my experience at Canada Without Poverty, I became exposed to the approach and the arguments for tackling poverty as a human rights issue, and it really has resonated with me, and I'm going to carry it with me the rest of my life. And I just believe very, very deeply that response, the response probably has to come from a very strongly grounded human rights framework.
So I want to get back to that in a second. I want to talk about the framework. I want to talk about the lens. Can you from your own experience, you talked about the gap. I mean, I've certainly seen the gap in the global south. I've seen it here in the streets of Toronto. I've seen it in Oakville. I mean, it's the richest place in Canada. Can you define poverty with Canadian poverty? Is there such a thing, or do we talk about it? I know Jeffrey Sachs in The End of Poverty talks about moderate, relative, and extreme. How would you position it?
Yeah, well, it is on a spectrum. In the field of poverty, working on poverty issues, we encounter these phrases of relative poverty and absolute poverty.
Right.
And it is hard to know where that change kicks in, but obviously a person who is literally starving to death, as some people are in our world, is in a situation of absolute deep poverty. People who are not starving to death, but who are having their health seriously compromised by their relative deprivation of basic needs, are dying a slower death. And one thing we know about poverty in Canada is that the poor do tend to live shorter lives. It's been documented in the city of Hamilton that people living in the lowest income neighborhoods have average lifespans, roughly 20 years shorter than, don't quote me on the 20 years, do have shorter lifespans than those in the higher income neighborhoods. So this has been documented by science, and it also, makes appeals to our common sense. If people have poor nutrition, greater stress, they are going to, more than likely or not, are going to have shorter lifespans than those who don't have those problems. So the absolute and the relative concepts are on a spectrum. I think what's really most important is to look at individuals that we see in our daily lives, that we encounter. And to recognize that some people are in a situation of much greater struggle than others just to meet their basic needs. So in my trip to PEI next week, in advance of that, I've interviewed 7 low-income women, and it turned out that they were all of my interviewees turned out to be women. I was hoping to have a bit of a mix of men and women, but the ones who were lined up ultimately turned out to be women, and each one of them had an incredible story of just trying to survive their from day to day, week to week, having their basic needs met, and they're not. None of them are successful in that regard. All of them are having to compromise their lives in some pretty serious ways that really come back to the health challenge.
Sure.
Inadequate nutrition, inadequate housing, the stress, not being able to afford certain basic needs that many other people in Canada are able to afford and may not even think about because they're so comfortably well off that it doesn't cross their mind that there are some people in this country who actually have to make a decision whether or not they're going to buy fresh vegetables or will forego a transit pass in favor of food, or vice versa. They'll forego food in favor of a transit pass. There are people experiencing this level of stressful decision-making because they simply do not have enough resources to meet their basic needs.
Do you
so
think
they are, if you will, they are dying a slower death.
Dying a slower death, yeah.
Yeah, one person actually made that kind of comment when she referred to what it's like to be on social assistance. She said it's like a form of slow death.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Well, it's the kind of thing, it seems to me, that until you walk in somebody's shoes, until you actually get down in the middle of it, there's really no way to know. And I've often wondered, with respect to, my focus for many years has been international development, and so I get over into a situation and I say, wow, if I could only get some key decision makers here in the community with me, the difference it could make.
Right.
They'll get to see the faces of the children. They'll get to see the faces of the abused women. They'll get to see the faces of the men who have no work, and so on and so on. And that's going to make all the difference. And I often wonder if that is true. And I wonder if it's true with Canadian poverty as well sometimes. Because I've certainly heard, and here's the question, do you think that we don't feel as a culture that poverty exists in Canada?
I think that view is fairly widespread. I don't know if there's been a survey done on that.
Yeah, I don't know that there has either. It would be helpful for sure.
I think that, I would say definitively that attitude does exist in Canada. How widespread it is, I don't know. I mean, there's been an explosion of anti-poverty work across Canada over the past decade or two. There's anti-poverty groups found in almost every community. They may not even call themselves that. They might just simply be soup kitchens and food banks and so forth.
Right.
If they're labeling themselves as an anti-poverty group, but there's certainly a level of consciousness in every community, and also we see quite commonly, news stories where a given politician has gone into a shelter for the day, or a soup kitchen is helping distribute food or clothing or whatever it is. And some politicians have taken up certain challenges that have been an issue to them to try to live on a welfare allowance for a month kind of a thing. So these kinds of things have been done. Even our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, I believe, has been photographed, working a kitchen, for a few minutes or something in a shelter.
I think I need to ask you a couple more questions about that. I didn't sense a tone there at all, Rob, but I did sense an interesting choice of words.
Yeah.
But even Stephen Harper for a few minutes. That's funny.
Well, yeah. I mean, because speaking frankly, his government has been pretty tone deaf on this issue since they came to power. And in my experience in Canada with poverty, where we tried to bring the issues further to light, it was very difficult with this particular government. And I say this in a completely nonpartisan way, because we in the anti-poverty movement would be thrilled and delighted to see a government of any stripe recognize poverty for what it is and make much more concerted efforts to deal with it in a much more holistic way.
Right.
I just didn't see that in the time that I was with Canada Without Poverty. I saw it very, in fairness, I didn't see it from many other governments as well. Although on the positive side in Canada, up until I left at the end of January, my position at Canada Without Poverty, but I believe 8 of the 10 provinces had committed to having an anti-poverty strategy of some kind, and a number of provinces have strategies in place, although they tend to be very weak.
Right.
And I think all 3 of the Northern Territories either have or have pledged to bring in an anti-poverty strategy of some kind. So, the consciousness has reached, fairly widely in our society, and we do have a number of politicians who take this issue very seriously. But still, I don't think the response has come to a foundation on human rights. And by that, I guess I can sort of go a bit further in saying that the person who does become sensitized to poverty, even if they have never experienced themselves, quite naturally the response is going to be coming from a place of empathy, which is good. Empathy has to be there, and so people empathizing with what it must be like for someone to have to make very, very difficult daily decisions about how they're going to meet their basic needs, and knowing all along that they're not going to be successful. They are going to have to forego something, because that is the reality for people in poverty in Canada. If they're on social assistance, which is the so-called program of last resort, there is hardly a social assistance program in Canada anywhere that is sufficient to meet a person's basic needs. In Prince Edward Island, I'm not sure if they have the exact level of monetary assistance that's given, but my sense is that at best it comes to about 50 to 60% of what the person really needs to receive.
Rob, who decides what those? I don't want to go all philosophical on you, but who decides what those basic needs are? Is that something that's purely subjective? Is that an independent kind of a thing, or is that actually laid out?
Well, that's a great question. It is a question that there have been attempts to answer that question in Canada and elsewhere. What constitutes basic needs? I don't have a survey I necessarily can point to there. But one of the most interesting tools or helpful tools in this regard is something called the Deprivation Index. And Ontario, I believe, is the only province that has or had, I'm not even sure if it's still being used in relation to Ontario's poverty reduction strategy, But Ontario, through some work of some NGOs, supported by the Ontario government, the current Ontario government, did come up with a Deprivation Index, which is a list of items that are considered to be essential to meet basic needs. And a person is considered to be in a situation of deprivation if they have to forego, one or two or more of those items. And I like that idea of coming up with an actual list that has broad support, broad agreement, and then, objectively evaluating what number or what percentage of citizens or families or households have to forego one or more of those items on the list.
I remember talking to Dennis Howlett from Make Poverty History some time back, and we were talking about Oakville, and Oakville being the richest place in Canada, and he said typically, in those kinds of communities, people that are not necessarily getting their basic needs met are being ignored. Tone deaf was the phrase he used with respect to the Conservatives. I think a lot of us are tone deaf when it comes to these kinds of issues, it seems to me. But especially in a rich community, because people say, well, what do you mean there's poverty in Oakville? And so, I've had people level that criticism at me before. Well, David, it's just social poverty. They can't take their kids to ballet. It's not actually, we're not actually talking about basic needs here.
Right. Yeah. So, the stratification of our society into income categories where we've got people who are extremely well off, we have people who are well off, we have people who are doing okay, not necessarily too concerned, we have people who are currently well off but concerned about their economic prospects, we have people who are not well off and extremely concerned about their economic prospects, and then we have people who are desperate.
Yes.
And every waking moment represents a moment of stress and worry about how they are going to pay this bill, take care of this need for their child, and so forth, because they simply know they do not have enough income coming through the door, nor any reasonable expectation that situation is going to change. And this is where we get into the complexity of the issue, because we have problems in our labor market, we have problems in our social security system, and when people find themselves in that lower end of the income spectrum, they may become trapped there. They may feel trapped. They may feel completely helpless and hopeless to ever escape it, because they see the barriers that are in front of them.
Right.
And it's not helpful for a person to have the attitude, well, a person can kind of will themselves out of these situations. Well, that's not necessarily so if you've got certain disabilities or have various barriers in front of you that are either barriers upon you into your physical being or your mental being, or they're barriers that society has put up.
Sure.
As an example, on Prince Edward Island, the first woman I spoke with, a very courageous young single mother, I think she's in her early 30s. She has a child who's 8 years old, and she recently made national news in registering her own sort of one-woman protest on the recent changes to the employment insurance system. She's drawing employment insurance right now, and has multiple times in the community that she lives in, which is a smaller community well outside of Charlottetown. Employment is just not something that is easily found, and it's a much more seasonal economy. And what she was hoping to do was go on to be able to pursue some accreditation in home care, where she's done some work in that area before, and that kind of work is available to her, but she does need to get some accreditation, so she's not going into that work without certain credentials. And so there's a program that she would like to be able to access that she could take for, I forget what the duration was, I think it was 9 months or so. It's a training program, and there's a cost to it, but she can't afford to go off social assistance to take that program, and she can't remain on social assistance while she's on that program. You would think that the PEI government would want to support a young woman like this in taking a program that will give her some credentials that will allow her to then to gain employment so she can come off social assistance. You'd think any government would want to support that and have a framework in place that allows a person to continue to receive income support while they're pursuing training, as opposed to going off that income support and either having to go into further debt, taking out a loan and so forth. So that to me is an example of a structural problem in the way that we're supporting our fellow citizens, and it's a problem that could well be solved. But beyond the immediacy of it is this whole question of the human right that this woman has to a basic level of social security, as well as a right to education. And I suppose we'll get shortly in the conversation to what that really means to ground the response to poverty in a human rights framework. If we do that, I think we'll see a much stronger. We'll see much more evidence of progress on this issue than we ever have to date. I mean, here in Ottawa, I'll just close off this little segment here by saying that here in Ottawa, one of the things that really struck me when I started working on the poverty issue is we have a shelter here in Ottawa that had or probably still has, I haven't been over there in a little while, a banner over its door that says, serving the homeless for 106 years. Now we're probably up to about 112 years since that banner first went up, I guess. But is that a success story? Or is that a story of failure that we have homelessness in this country for over a century? We're into the second century of serving the homeless. Why are we serving the homeless at all? We shouldn't have a single person in this country that's homeless. And I know that the work of that shelter is stellar in terms of the kind of support they provide to the people that come through the doors there. But a human rights framework would allow us to eliminate homelessness. It would allow us to eliminate poverty in our time. And unless we, as a society, get around to making our response from a human rights framework, I'm not confident at all that we're going to see any real progress on this issue.
So I want to come back to the whole notion of solving extreme poverty versus solving poverty, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about human rights. And 1948 was a big year for human rights. The Universal Declaration and so on. I mean, can you say that they didn't exist before then? Or, I guess what I'm getting at is, can you tell us a little bit more about that history and how we found ourselves in 1948? And you comment in your paper that you shared with me, and maybe we can even make it available online, income security as a human right, that you gave at a workshop at the Basic Income Earth Network in 2009. You say that it's pretty new. Really?
It's very, very new. In the talk that I gave back in 2009 on income security as a human right, and I sort of mirrored much of that content in a couple of presentations a year later out in Alberta. The concept of human rights is very, very recent in our evolutionary history. Human beings in our sort of current or in our modernized form, as we go back about 200,000 years, and the first articulation of anything approaching a human right didn't happen until about 1215 in the Magna Carta, or what's known as the Great Charter in English. And this required the King John of England at the time. He proclaimed certain rights that would pertain to what were called freemen, and this was the first known articulation of anything approaching a human right. And a human right simply is something that exists, if you will, as like a contract between human beings. There are rights holders, and the people who have to honor those rights are the duty bearers. It took quite a while for many more centuries to pass before we came around to some more mature articulation of exactly what are human rights and what types of rights do people have. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was the first global articulation amongst the community of nations as to a set of rights that everybody has by virtue of being human. And in those catalog of rights are, the right to food, the right to housing, the right to social security, the right to an adequate standard of living sufficient for a person's health, and other forms of what are known as now as economic and social rights. So it was a breakthrough document, and we're now going on close to 70 years. It'll be 70 years in 5 years. We're 65 years along now. And, some of those rights have come further to the forefront, and others are lagging a bit in terms of the recognition. And, certainly for a country like Canada, we are still very much in the early days of even really recognizing, let alone living up to many of the rights that we signed onto as a country back in 1948. However, it does represent a milestone moment, and it's probably going to take a couple more generations before those rights are given the fullest recognition that they ought to be given. And it's going to require, some human rights education and a maturation of our society. Yeah, go ahead.
Rob, you talked about maturation, you talked about education and so on, and I've spoken about it before many times to my class and to public talks that I've given and so on, and probably on a recent podcast. But do you think education is the silver bullet here in some regards? My children are 5 and 7. They're growing up in a home that's, we're making them aware of these issues, these concerns, these, we try to have pretty mature dialogues with them already at their age. And so is that where the hope is to be found? My son loves to recycle. I don't. I do it because I think I should,
right?
Because I feel obligated, and I'd rather do something else. But he sees, it's almost as if he gets some pleasure in it. Well, I mean, Dad, what do you mean you're going to throw that in the garbage? So, can we expect that same thing out of our kids and the next generation and the next generation after that they're going to, I take it to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, I think education is critical. It's through education, either formal or informal, that a person's mind becomes expanded, and we begin to see horizons. We see the perspectives that come across the color spectrum. We have to overcome our ignorance, and I think our society is deeply ignorant when it comes to the question of human rights. We've all heard the phrase. We know that people have certain rights. If you're arrested, probably the first question is, well, what rights do I have if I'm arrested? Which is an interesting question unto itself. But we probably don't do a very good job yet in bringing human rights into a more integral way into our educational system. I believe young children can begin to grasp these concepts, at quite an early age, and at the very least should it be exposed to them. And
I would agree. Yeah.
They should be themselves be asking questions about what human rights mean. We teach children. I mean, a big issue now is bullying, and bullying represents an affront of human rights. Mm-hmm. A person has the right not to be bullied. They have a right not to be physically struck. They have the right not to be, if you will, verbally struck, and that's what bullying largely represents. It's a verbal striking. It's an emotional striking of another person's psyche, and obviously it can lead to some fatal consequences. So the language of human rights surrounds concepts like bullying very, very well. In fact, there's an opportunity in the whole bullying field, if you will. That's the right way to frame it. The response to bullying could be framed in a broader way around a conversation of human rights. So I think it's vital that our educational systems, formal educational systems, and within households at the dinner table, have conversations about human rights.
Yeah, the distinction between formal and informal, I think, is essential. I remember being in Cambodia a few years back and talking to a U.S. government official who said that Cambodia's problems can't be solved, by or would easily be solved by about 100 funerals or a few less. So in other words, there's this group of people that are still working within a certain framework that is antiquated, and once we get rid of that, we're going to be okay. Is that what we're talking about with regard to human rights? I mean, is it just time? I mean, or is it something that we're looking, is it way down the road because of the systemic nature of something so complex?
I think the honest answer to that is we are still living in an era. We're in the 21st century, but in many ways we're still kind of living with 18th century and 19th century mindsets. Certainly, when I think of the kind of social security system we still have, I think it's very much a 20th century, if not even 19th century, reflective 20th or 19th century mindset. So I think, as I said, I think we're several generations yet away from a fuller realization of human rights. We may be 100, 200, even 300 years away from a fuller realization of human rights. And it's one of the tragedies of being a human being who's conscious of these things is we can see the solution. But the solution may not come at all in our lifetime.
That's right. That's pretty funny. I teach on Tuesdays, and today is Tuesday, and I was talking to a couple of my students about that very same thing. I said, I don't know that we're going to see it in our lifetimes together, but it's something that we need to at least keep working towards if we truly believe that change is incremental. Yeah,
I mean, there's a fantastic book which I will recommend to anybody who's listening to this called "Inventing Human Rights." A history by an American historian named Lynn Hunt. And she has a wonderful phrase in there, which I incorporate into my paper, and I'll just quote it here. It says, "Human rights only become meaningful when they gain political content. They are rights that require active participation from those who hold them." And I love that. I love that idea. Mm-hmm. We can put human rights down in a universal declaration and other types of documents, but unless we really seize them
yes.
and hold them close to our daily life and put them into practice, they end up just being empty words.
Yeah.
And we end up with situations of abuse all over the world, all through our communities where people
haven't you just punctured the inefficacy of, say, the UN Security Council, for instance? We can talk about these. We can write them down. We can even sign certain agreements, but it doesn't mean we're going to necessarily follow through.
No, that is correct. In 1948, these human rights were put down in a charter, and it's apparently become one of the world's most translated documents, and so forth. So there's the idea of these human rights has spread from that time, but it's really still only very recently that even within the UN system that human rights are being given broader attention. Actually, as we speak, colleagues of mine from Canada Without Poverty have recently been in Geneva to attend and participate in what's known as the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, which is the UN's relatively new and recent system for having the performance of nations with respect to human rights evaluated by other member states. So it's a peer review process by which given states hold up each other to shining a light on how they are doing in performing on human rights issues, from political rights and civil rights to economic and social rights and cultural rights, the 5 major categories of rights that have been put out there. And so this system, called the UPR, Universal Periodic Review, only came into being in the past 10 years.
Wow. It just showed we're babies.
Yeah, we're babies at this. And the system itself is, has a lot of room for deserved criticism, that it's still probably not as thorough as it needs to be, but at the very least it does represent an attempt to recognize that human rights need to be evaluated at the highest political levels, and a peer review process, I think, is a pretty good way to do it. So it's not a weakness of the system that Iran might be evaluating Canada and Canada might be evaluating Iran. In fact, it's a strength.
Yes.
Because some nations are going to be stronger performers and some are going to be egregious violators. Well, let them both sit in a room and talk about what's wrong and bring forth the witnesses and the observers and the advocates from within those countries to talk within countries and across countries about how well or how poorly a nation is doing within its borders. We do live in a world of borders still, of countries, defining our landscape and people having national identities, and so a lot of the conversations on human rights have to take place within those geographical boundaries, but they're also happening across geographical boundaries, and that's all positive. Martin Luther King said, among his many brilliant observations of the human condition, he did say that the arc of human history tends to bend towards justice, and I firmly believe that as well. And the articulation of human rights, the recognition of human rights, the defense of human rights, are all in that arc, and we're still on the early incline of that arc.
Still too early to tell.
It's still too early to tell, but I do have faith, to the extent that I have any faith at all. I do have faith that as time moves on, history will continue to bend towards the arc of justice, and that that human rights will gain further and further recognition. We've seen this in Canada with, I would say, fairly broad societal acceptance of same-sex marriage. It's not 100%, but I think the broad swath of society has come to recognize that we cannot discriminate the practice of marriage based on sexual orientation. It's just that represents an abuse of a person's right to decide who it is they want to love and associate with for the rest of their lives in a formal marital contract. The United States is now going through a similar period of giving recognition to same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships. They're not quite as far along, I think, as Canada in that regard, but it's coming, and it's a question that
we're the liberals to most, to many Americans, I should say, not to most.
Yes.
Those crazy liberal Canadians. Hey, is it Charles Fried? He's the American lawyer and scholar that you refer to in your essay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to. Believe it or not, we're getting close to having to come to an end. But I want to end with the quote that you used from him about a violation of a right always being wrong. But before we go there, Rob, I wondered, you're saying you think that many of us are deeply ignorant when it still comes to these issues of human rights. Can you? I mean, and I mean this. Can you educate us a little bit? What does it mean to look at this through what does it mean to live your life through a human rights lens? I guess,
right. So when we see a person on the street who's homeless, whether or not we approach that person or whether or not we help that person or not, probably all of us think, oh, isn't that terrible? That person does not have enough to eat. It doesn't have a place to sleep. I'm hoping that thought is in everybody's head. So we're sort of empathetic towards that individual. What we don't tend to say, if we don't have the human rights education, the human rights language, the human rights concept, we may not say to ourselves, that person actually has a right to those things. It's because they're human that they have a right to food, they have a right to housing, they have a right to the other forms of human rights that have been articulated in the Universal Declaration and subsequent international human rights law. I go further in my paper. I indicate I believe that income security itself has to become a human right. But by that I mean everybody ought to receive, by virtue of their being a human being, they ought to receive a share of whatever wealth exists in the society such that their basic needs can be protected as best as possible, without them having to participate in the labor market necessarily, just because they are human. Now, we do this in a sense for children, we do this in a sense for people who are seniors, but we don't tend to do it very well for the entire population. Moving from a recognition of needs to a recognition of rights is really quite vital.
It's great.
And then what would happen then for the people who are homeless? They need to have a place where they can claim that right. So if you do not have a place to sleep, you do not have a place to live, we need to create a society that makes sure that those opportunities are available for people, and that the responsible authorities feel a better obligation to make sure that those rights are made real for people.
So is the reaction then ultimately of somebody walking along the street, oh wow, this is horrible, this shouldn't exist, here's a couple bucks for you, to I'm going to actually get involved, or I'm going to write a letter, or I'm going to assist this person, maybe give them some money, get them to the shelter, but then I'm going to take it to the next step as well? Is that kind of what seeing that situation through a human right lens? Well,
I think ultimately where we need to get to is that the duty bearers are, in many cases, are governments. Not all the time. Sometimes the duty bearers are ourselves, or they're the families, or whatever. But when you're looking at large, broad-scale social security, the duty bearers have to be our government. That's why we formed governments in the first place, is to provide a framework by which certain needs can be provided for, collectively with governments to administer that. That's basically why governments exist, and to help regulate conduct and make sure that there's these kinds of things are taken care of. I think ultimately what we need to get to is that our governments at all levels, municipal, provincial, federal, territorial, need to recognize that they are duty bearers. They have a responsibility to the human rights that have been articulated, and in their construction of laws and programs to have at the forefront what are we doing to ensure that these rights are being protected? And that would vault issues like homelessness to the forefront. Why are we having conversations about the next generation fighter jets, costing multiple billions, or support for, sports stadiums, or whatever it happens to be that is clearly of lesser importance than a person's need to eat and a person's need to have decent housing, and so forth. So governments as duty bearers, if they were truly mature, in my view, they would put these rights at the forefront of their daily concerns, their decision-making, and they would say, in our community, in our province, does everyone have a decent place to live? And by that I don't mean a single house or whatever, or a dwelling of any particular luxury. What I do mean, though, is that everyone does need to have a decent place to live that's clean, that's going to be affordable, that's going to be adequate for their health.
So based on what you said earlier, I mean, that sounds top-down to me, but I don't get that sense from you at all. So top-down from a duty-bearer perspective, but hang on a second, how about from an informal education perspective? How about from just from a very grassroots perspective within the context of families and relationships? How are we actually speaking about these issues? So you're not suggesting it's an either-or, are you?
No, and I would actually caution against even thinking about it in terms of top-down and bottom-up, because unfortunately I think the phrase top-down has become associated with government, and it kind of plays into that anti-government mindset. All government is a collection of individuals who've been entrusted with certain responsibilities on behalf of the rest of us. And we elect governments, we form governments, we finance government. It's as if we were, imagine the human community being 1,000 people, and we task 100 of those people to help look after certain things that are best looked after by those 100 people, maintaining roads or building schools or administering hospitals or whatever it happens to be, and entrusting it in a collective way to those individuals to make wise decisions on the use of the resources that are provided to provide the services that we need to have provided in a collective way. It doesn't make sense for us to go individually build our own sidewalks, so we give governments some money so that they can build sidewalks and maintain sidewalks for our collective and common use. So that's really all that government is, and I think what I'm trying to say is that in the mature view of society, citizens would demand of those people who've been entrusted with these responsibilities to ensure that those responsibilities are met for these rights that have been articulated. And those people who have been given that responsibility, who hold elected office or service, public servants, would know, would embrace, would value, would love the idea that they are there to ensure that these rights are upheld. So if people do not have enough resources to meet their basic needs, well, by golly, we're going to ensure that those resources are available. And there's all kinds of tools that people, public servants and elected officials have at their disposal, principally through the tax system and the distribution. I won't even say the redistribution. I'll say the distribution of the wealth that's created in our country. Interestingly, in New Brunswick, I just read online that the New Brunswick government is restoring income tax levels to 2006 before they were cut in a very misguided way. They followed bad advice, and they cut income and corporate tax rates, and they've literally starved the government of revenue. Well, now the conservative government, the progressive conservative government in New Brunswick, is reversing those decisions of 7 years ago, realizing they were a mistake because they have starved the state of its ability to help meet the basic needs of the population. Wow. So they've kind of learned a very hard lesson. Which when I was at Canada Without Poverty, we wrote a letter to the New Brunswick government advising them and urging them not to go through with the tax cuts that they had been recommended to them by an economist who is on the sort of the free market end of the spectrum. So, governments have to have the resources available to allocate to ensure that a range of needs and a range of rights are going to be protected. And that's really all that governments are there to do.
It's the top-down, bottom-up. Doing away with that distinction is probably actually really helpful. It's I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and it's the same when we talk about right wing and left wing. These concepts box us in.
Well, it's all about polarization, right? And it immediately positions you in an either or framework. And I've got no time for that. I don't know that it's ever either or actually, and that kind of positions itself into this mathematical, quantifiable universe that, frankly, most of us don't live in.
Yes. We're constantly existing in, pardon the phrase, shades of gray. We constantly are, and there are some things which are clearly right and clearly wrong. But I think the polarization of our debates, our dialogue, our politics, these things are not helping us at all. We have to fight back against attempts to put things in sort of simplistic terms this way, and we have to remain very open to learning and having conversations with people who may not see the issues quite the same way that we do and may never, ever see the issues quite the same way. But I think there is common ground. Interestingly, the whole subject of income security, this idea of a basic income or guaranteed income, has had appeal to people who would identify themselves as being right-leaning or left-leaning, or others might have identified them in that way. It's interesting to me that the concept has received support from either end of the spectrum and through the middle of the spectrum. And in Canada, Senator Hugh Segal, who's a progressive conservative senator, former chief of staff to Brian Mulroney, and a brilliant guy. He's probably our leading political proponent of a basic income. And I would say Senator Segal is from my conversation with him, would be, I think basically his argument does rest ultimately on a human rights foundation, more so than a charitable kind of foundation. And on the more liberal end of the spectrum, people like the economist, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, was a proponent of this as well.
I would love, if we can come back to it maybe at another time, I would love to chat with you about how do we just get people on the same page with respect to human rights. I find internationally, when I see the crimes against humanity that are rearing their ugly heads around the world in different countries and in different ways, and when you look at things like slavery being worse today than it was in William Wilberforce's time, I mean, what the hell's going on? And yet I'm with you. I'm with King and this idea of arcing towards justice. But wow, it just seems like, boy, we've got a long way to go.
We do, and there's a lot of backsliding on this question of human rights being recognized and protected, and we unfortunately are living in an era where there are incredibly egregious examples of human rights violations. Everything from societal-wide rape going on in the Congo to human trafficking, sort of nightmarish things that are happening despite the articulation of human rights in the past couple hundred years or so, from the French Declaration of Man and the U.S. American Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other types of articulations of what it means to have a decent human existence. And we have these incredible violations going on. But the consciousness of these things is I think very, very great, in part because of the communication technologies that allow evidence of abuse to spread instantly.
One of the benefits of globalization.
Yes, definitely one of the benefits of globalization. It's still an open-ended question: is ultimately where might this all be leading? We could slide into a global totalitarian kind of existence. That is not an implausible scenario.
Yeah.
But equally, if not more plausible, is that more and more people are just going to say, you know what, we're going to not only let live, but we're going to do a much better of accepting our responsibilities to each other and doing so in a peaceful way.
To borrow from the 70s phrase, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'd like to see a little bit more of that, frankly. I really would. I mean, I think we are seeing plenty of it around the world in many different ways, but I think a little bit more of that on a regular basis would do us all the world of good. So, Rob, we got to wrap up. You're hopeful? You sure sound like it.
I am hopeful. I mean, I think there are still very, very deeply troubling signs, say on the environmental side and climate change, for example, which is another issue we haven't spoken about here. But I think there's some very deeply troubling things that we all have to be terribly concerned with, because we ultimately are also biological beings living on a finite planet, and our planet's under tremendous ecological stress. So on that score, I feel less hopeful. But on the social side, I feel hopeful because I guess ultimately I believe that human beings are good, more so than not, and that most people want to be good and do good. And with that goodwill that's out there, I think there's really not any problem that we can't solve. But it's going to take time. I think a lot of the solutions will come beyond our own lifetimes and will be realized, decades to centuries hence. But I think, again, the arc of history is bending in that direction, and that is reason to be hopeful. But at the same time, we have a lot of darkness that we have to confront in our daily existence.
Thanks, Rob, for joining me here today, and I hope we can do this again.
That would be lovely, David. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much.